Hi. This video is going to discuss your options for setting configuration variables when using ThinClient and, by extension, WebClient. I'm also going to discuss that mysterious -lc runtime option and the difference between a remote and a local configuration file. Now, there are three main places to set configuration variables when you're running in ThinClient. Each option differs in where the properties file is located and what the scope of that properties file is. The first option is to specify a properties file when you start the application server. The variables in this properties file are going to be used by every client that connects to the server, ThinClients and WebClients. They're also used by programs that are loaded remotely and files that are accessed through the file server. I have some examples on the screen. The first example shows how to set the properties file when you start the application server from the command line with isc server. The second does the same thing, but if your properties file is called isCOBOL.properties, you don't have to add it to your command line. It'll be picked up automatically. The third example is when you start the application server as a service. The way to pass command line options in this case in Linux is to set isserver_ops in the system environment. If you're using a Windows service, then you would set the config in isserver.vm options found in the bin directory. And these are examples of both of those cases. The second option is to set variables from a configuration file that is on the server, but it isn't called when the server is started up. It's added to the command line on the client side when the client connects, and therefore we call it a remote configuration file because it's remote to the client. Now, in this case, the scope of the variables is only for that client session. The examples that I have on the screen show some possibilities for when this option is used. As you can see, these property files are often used for customer or program-specific variables, or they're used for the type of the session that's running, like the end of the month or for batch processing. Now, look at the second example here. It uses an alternative to the -c runtime switch. And this is the -j-d followed by isCOBOL.remote_conf and then the value. This is what the -c switch expands to in the runtime framework, and you can use either one of these syntaxes. And the third option is that lc switch that I said I would talk about, the local configuration file. When you're running in ThinClient mode and one of your application's programs are on the client-side machine, you'll use the call client syntax. Now, in this case, you might want to refer to a properties file that is also on the client-side machine. And this is where you use the -lc switch. These properties are only used when that client-side program is running. So remember that the configuration file is always referred to in terms of where it is in relationship to the client. In other words, if the configuration file is on the client side, it's local. If it's on the server, then it's remote to the client. Now, you can combine that -c and the -lc to include two different properties files, one on the server and one that's local. When the local program is called, the runtime knows to use the properties file passed with the lc switch. So let's look at the examples. In the first example, you may have a program specific to the client called acme2, and the IS application code would do a call client acme2. Now, acme2 would be executed on the client, and it would use the values in acme2.properties that it finds on the client in C acme, but only for the scope of the acme2 program. The second example calls a .istc file. Now, if your client machine doesn't have the istc extension mapped to the isCOBOL ThinClient in file associations, you can still use the istc file because it's considered a local configuration file. So you can pass it to the isc client with the -lc switch, and it'll launch the program. Now, note in this example, instead of using -lc, I'm using the -j-d isCOBOL.conf. That's what the -lc expands out to with the runtime. So either one of those will work. Now, before we get to the demonstration, I want to talk about setting variables. Remember that if you set a variable twice, the last value, red, is the one that's used. So here's an example. When ISC server is started, it loads acme.properties. And acme.properties uses the GUI icon abc-logo.jpg. But when the client is started, it adds another properties file called LAF1, and it overwrites certain default values like the font default, but it also overrides the icon file, the file that is used on the Windows. So it will be abc-logo1.bitmap. So when main prog starts, the Windows will have abc-logo1.bitmap, and their default font will be 8-point Arial. So let's take a look at all of this. First, I want to show you all three of those options together. And I'm going to do that with our sample program, which is in the AS sample folder under AS configurations. And there are two subfolders in there, one client, one server. So let's go to the server. Here we have a lot of properties files. The first one that I want to look at is AS properties. When I start the server, I'm going to reference that one. So AS properties is the one that's going to be used by every client that connects. And it's going to set a variable called env general, and this is the value that's going to set. So let's do that. All right, so that's going. Now the client is going to reference two properties files, one with the -c and one with the -lc. And the C, of course, is going to be here where the server is. We're going to pick up the variables in myapp1.properties. So let's take a look at that. It sets env application so that while the client is running, this will be the value of that variable. On the client side, representing the client machine, we have a client.properties. So let's take a look at that. The client properties will set env client to this value for as long as the client-side program is running. So let's run that. And let's look at what was output. So when we started ISC server with the AS properties, it set this variable to this value. And then when IS client was started, it used the -c and it picked up the environment application, and there's the value of it. And then it called the program client prog. And in client prog, the runtime looked at this file, the LC, and it picked up these variables. And then it returned to my prog and it exited. There's an example of when each configuration can be set and where its values can be picked up. Now let's take a look at running the Istc file. I'm going to start the server on a different port here, and we're in the isApplication folder. And also in the isApplication folder is an isApplication.istc. And I changed the port number, and you see the remote config is isCOBOL properties, because that is the name of the file that is in the folder where the server started, and the default program is isApplication. And so over here I have isc client, and I have the -lc. I'm picking up the client side configuration file, isApplication.istc. And when I run this, it will launch isApplication with the server side properties called isCOBOL.properties. And here's isApplication. I'm going to test this now in WebClient. I have a folder here that will act as the server side, and it has a server properties and a server program. This program will call a program on the client side. So let's look at server properties. And server properties sets myvar, and it says that it's set from this file here. And then it's going to call the client side, and on the client side is this local program, which reads the variables in local properties. So let's look at local properties. And it's setting myvar to the local properties value and myvar2 to hello from the client. And I'm also setting the code prefix here. So as always, before we try something in the web client, we're going to run it in ThinClient, make sure it runs there. So I have ThinClient running in this server folder. Then I'm going to run isc client and pass with the -lc, that local properties, and then run the server program. And this program displays 3 messages. The first one says that it's from the server-side program, and it's getting a setting of myvar from server properties. And server properties doesn't set my var2, so my var2 is blank. The next one is from the client-side program. And you see that the value of my var has been changed, so now it's being set in the client local properties. And my var2 is set to hello from the client. When the runtime returns to the server-side program, the variables that were set with the -lc are no longer set. My var is back to being set in server.properties, and my var2 is not set. So now that it runs in the ThinClient, let's run it in the WebClient. I have the WebClient running already, and I've created an app called config test. And here we have the name of the program, server prog, and here is the -lc under local configuration. And so I've set it to the local properties. And that's all I need to set. Now let's run it. And here's my first message. My var is set in server properties. My var2 is not set. Now from the client-side program, my var is set in local properties. My var2 is set to hello from the client. And back to the server, and it's back to the original values, server.properties, and blank from my var2. And that's a review of the application server and web client and how it picks up configuration variables, what the scope of those variables and property files are, and the difference between a remote and a local configuration file. If you have any questions, we're always available at support@variant.com. Thank you.